start streaming. And just to remind y'all, they can hear you, but they can't see you. So you are incognito. All right, let me make sure it's live on YouTube there. Perfect. Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to our Galatians class. Just to give you a kind of a fun update, I'm doing this same class, or at least a version of it, on Tuesday mornings. And the first week we probably had, there was probably 4 or 5 of us there. And the next week there was probably 6 or 7, and we had about 8. Tuesday we had 16. So we doubled it just in the few weeks. And so they're going to go back and invite more people, so the word's spreading. And if you want the copy of the handouts, there's 2 different handouts. There's a handout like that, and there's also like a commentary style handout. All of those are done up to Galatians chapter 2 and verse 10, what we're talking about tonight. So you can go download those at labornotinvain.com/Galatians. And that link is at the bottom of the YouTube description and at the bottom of the screen. So let's go to the book of Galatians, and let's just touch on one quick thing before we get into chapter 2, and that is a question. Question I asked last week. There are 2 major defenses that Paul is giving in chapters 1 and 2. What are those? What's he having to defend?
That he's an apostle, and
right,
the gospel is.
Exactly. His apostleship and his law-free gospel, as we've styled it. That is, that the Gentiles can keep the gospel without any obligation to the law. And this is what we've basically been talking about for the past 24 verses. So let's get to chapter 2 and look at verse 1. He says, after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. Now, when did Barnabas and when did Barnabas and Paul split up for a while? Do you remember what chapter that was, Karen?
Well, I know they split up because of Mark. Mark.
That's right.
But I don't know what chapter it was.
That was at the end of chapter 15. So it was actually right after the events of what we're talking about here in Galatians 2, the council at Jerusalem. So Barnabas and Paul split up right after this event here, and we're going to get into, we're not going to get into why he split up, but we are going to get into some trouble that happened next week. But Titus, what is significant about Titus? What nationality is he not? Can't really say what nationality he is, but what nationality is he not? Karen?
Jewish.
That's right. He is a Gentile, or he is a Greek. So Paul is taking Barnabas, who is Jewish. Barnabas was one of the very first Christians. If you think back to Acts chapter 4 and 5, do you remember what major thing he did at the beginning of the book of Acts with his land? Karen, what you got?
Well, someone else can go, but he was sent out with Paul to preach the gospel.
Okay, that's true. But before Paul's conversion, how did Paul get his nickname, the Son of Encouragement? What did he do concerning his land? What were they doing at the first of Acts, from between Acts chapter 2?
Oh, they were giving it away.
That's right. They were selling their land in order to distribute it to the poor, right? Okay. So let's look at verse 2 now. He says, it was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preached among the Gentiles, but I did so in private to those who are of reputation, for fear that somehow I might be running or had run in vain. So again, he emphasizes the origin of his apostleship. I went up because of a revelation, not because the apostles sent for him, not because the elders at the church in Jerusalem wanted him to come. He went up because God told him to. The reason why he's emphasizing this again is because his apostleship is under attack. People are saying that he's not a real apostle because of whatever reason, but really because of their jealousy of him and the inclusion of the Gentiles into the new covenant community without having to be circumcised and things like that. So He said that he submitted to them the gospel which he preaches. The gospel that he preaches is the same gospel that Peter and them were preaching as well, but he's preaching it specifically to the Gentiles. And what was unique about it was that it was the law, it was the gospel without being burdened by the law. And that's why I call this class Galatians, the unencumbered gospel of Jesus. Now, it might be flipped or backwards for you, but that's what it doesn't say uncucumbered, it says unencumbered. The unencumbered gospel of Jesus, which means it's the gospel plus nothing else. And so in Galatians 2 and verse 2, he says that he preached this among the Gentiles, and he was talking to those who were of no reputation, rather who were of reputation. Sorry about that, forgot to mute my phone. He was talking to those who were of reputation, and we're going to figure out that who he's talking about there is Peter and James, and I believe it was John. I think he says down in verse 9 who that was. But here's why he brings up Peter, James, and John, those who are of reputation. He says in verse 3, "But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised." In other words, while he was with the leaders of the church, Peter, James, John, and the others, none of them tried to get Titus to be circumcised. They had no interest in doing that whatsoever. Now, what's significant about that is, again, this is another defense of Paul's apostleship and his law-free gospel to the Gentiles. What he's saying is, not only am I saying that he should not be circumcised and that I'm a true apostle of God, but those who were of reputation in the Jerusalem church, they also didn't think he should be circumcised. So not only is it me, not only is it, of course, God, but it's also them. They don't have to, they didn't think that he needed to be circumcised either. But notice who it was that was bringing up this trouble here in verse 4. He says, "Yet it was a concern because of the false brothers secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to enslave us." Very quickly, let's go back to Acts 15. You can keep your pen there or wherever, but let's go to Acts 15 and take a look at what they were saying. And you'll really see what Paul means when he says that they would try to enslave us. Acts 15 and verse 1, if somebody would like, they can read that passage for us there in Acts 15 and verse 1.
Some men came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the brothers, "Unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved."
That's right. So unless you're circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Do you see how different that is from the gospel that they were preaching? Like, for example, look at what he says in Acts chapter 10. Look what Peter says in Acts chapter 10. In verse 43, for example, Peter says in Acts 10, "All the prophets testify of him, that through his name everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins." Do you see how shocking it was then for these individuals to come along in 15 and say, "Hey, if you're not circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved"? That goes against everything that both Peter and Paul had been preaching to the Gentiles up to this point. And so this is what Paul meant when he said another gospel. See, it's the gospel that saves, right? Romans 1:16, that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew and also to the Greek. So for them to say the gospel isn't enough, you need to be circumcised as well, was to rob the gospel of its power. For them to say that they needed to do X, Y, and Z concerning the law in order to have salvation was saying that salvation doesn't come through Jesus, it comes through Moses. That when Jesus said it is finished on the cross, he didn't really mean it. There's something else that they had to do in order to earn their salvation. So this is why Paul is so against. The Gentiles obeying any aspect of the law. Karen, what you got?
Are these the false teachers that Jesus spoke about when he told the apostles there'll be false teachers?
Yeah, I think they fall into that category for sure. Um, when you look at the false teachers in the book of Matthew, especially, you really begin seeing that brought up in Matthew chapter 7. He talks about the wolves in sheep's clothing and all that. And if you look at the content of the Sermon on the Mount, what Jesus says all through chapter 5 is, "You've heard it has been said, but I say unto you." And he's countering the traditional interpretations of the Pharisees and the other religious leaders at that time. And so so when he said false teachers in Matthew chapter 7, 13 and following, really 15 and following, he's talking about those who are adding to the law their own traditions and who are misinterpreting and misapplying. So yes, it would include these who were coming along after Paul and after Peter and saying, no, unless you're circumcised according to the customs of Moses, you cannot be saved. They were to follow the teachings of Jesus, not the traditions and customs of the law. So I think you're right in saying that. And of course, one other thing about that. For example, in 1 Timothy 4, in verse 3, Paul does talk about those who are teaching doctrines of demons, teachings of demons, and one of the things they were telling them is to abstain from food. So you do have those, abstain from certain kinds of food. So you do have those same kind of teachings going on concerning the customs of the law long after Paul wrote the letter to the Galatians. That was about what, eight or so years after Galatians was written, depending on when you date the book. Keep in mind, the Galatians could have been written anytime between 47, 48, and 58. So it's really depends on where you date the book. But Second Timothy, First and Second Timothy, which was written after, talks about these individuals who are abusing the law, and they didn't know what they were talking about. Paul talks about in 1 Timothy 1. And so, yes, I would say those are the same false teachers that Jesus warned about. Now, I will say, Carol, what you got?
Well, in 1 Timothy 4:3 about the demons, is that the false teachers?
Well, he calls it the doctrine of demons. He doesn't say that demons were teaching, but that it was the teaching. It was a demonic teaching, a teaching that was not from a messenger of heaven, but from a messenger of Satan. So I think that they were men who were teaching, but that but it was a demonic kind of doctrine in 1 Timothy 4:3.
Kind of like Antichrist.
Yeah,
It's against Christ.
right.
Was it Judaizers?
Yes, I believe so. And the reason why I think that, Carol, is if you go back to 1 Timothy chapter 1, look what he says here in his introduction of the book. Because 1 Timothy 1, Paul's trying to encourage Timothy to stand up against these people when they show up. And what he says in chapter 1 and verse 6 is, some people have strayed from these things and have turned aside to fruitless discussion, wanting to be teachers of the law, even though they do not understand either what they are saying or the matters about which they are making confident assertions. So these were teachers of the law who didn't know what they were talking about. And so I'd put them in the same category as the Judaizers. One thing I was going to add, Karen, was you mentioned, were these those who Jesus was talking about, the false teachers? I think yes, on one hand, but on the other hand, I do want to point out that the teachers that Jesus had in mind, for example, in Matthew 24, he tells you what they were going to say. They would say, "Here's Christ, there is Christ. He's out in the wilderness. He's in the inner room." And so while they do fall into the category of the false teachers that Jesus had in mind in other places, I think Matthew 24 is specifically talking about, for example, those in 2 Thessalonians 2 and verse 2 who were saying that the Lord had already come, or maybe those in 2 Timothy 2 that said that the resurrection had already passed. I think that's who Paul specifically had in mind. I mean, Jesus specifically had in mind there, but in other areas, yes, I think he was talking about the Judaizers. Karen?
I just read a book about Jerusalem. It's 250 years old. I think I sent you the link.
Yes.
And it talks about there was actually guys that said they were the Messiah that said, come out into the wilderness.
Yes.
And maybe Jesus was talking about them.
Well, there were several people, if you recall,
Right.
even before Jesus, that was doing that. Like in Acts chapter 5, I believe, where you have Gamaliel that stands up and he says, "You remember this fellow and this other, and they were trying to lead a revolt against Rome, and they died out and all that kind of stuff." Um, and remember, even Paul at one point when he was arrested in Acts 21, the Roman guard who came was confused. They thought that Paul was this Egyptian guy that had been trying to revolt against Rome. So yes, there were a rebel against Rome. So there were a lot of individuals around that time who were zealots, who were trying to stir up a crowd to go against the Roman government. And keep in mind that sometimes when we think of Christ, we think, oh, they were saying that they were the Son of God. No, that's not what they were saying in that way that we think of Jesus. They were saying that they were anointed, because that's what the word Christ means, the anointed one. They were saying that they were anointed as God's servant to take back Jerusalem from the Romans. So they might not have been saying specifically that they were the Son of God. They were just saying that they were like David or one of the prophets or priests in the Old Covenant who were anointed to accomplish some task of God. And in that particular case, it was going out and taking back Jerusalem and the temple from the Roman government, right? Or out from under their
So
foot.
were they saying they were the Messiah then, but not the Son of God
Yes. Well,
in a way?
yeah. So just keep in mind that that we believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. If we say that Jesus is Christ, that within and of itself doesn't mean that he's the Son of God, because there's a lot of people who were Christs in the Old Testament, because the word Christ or the word Messiah just means the anointed one. We say we believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that the Messiah is God's Son. There were a lot of anointed individuals in the Old Testament, but we're talking about specifically the Christ, the Son of God. Those who were claiming to be the Christ, like the Egyptian and those in Matthew 24 that I mentioned, proceeding to follow Jerusalem, they were saying that they were anointed like the prophets were to go out and be representatives of God and fighting against Rome. We placed more emphasis on that title, the Christ, than maybe they did. You have to keep in mind that as well that we put prophet, priest, and king all into one person, Jesus, whereas they didn't necessarily do that to begin with. Just reading the Old Testament without having the New Testament to interpret it like we do, like without having Jesus to interpret it like we have, they may have thought of different, the son of David on one hand, a great priest in another, or whatever. So just we have a much more centralized Christological view of the prophecies in the Old Testament, whereas they might have looked for several different figures, not just one figure to fulfill all of those roles. So, and also another thing to keep in mind as well, the concept of the Son of God is found in the Old Testament, of course, but it was also a political term, because it's the term that the kings of the day had adopted for themselves, like the Roman emperors, right? And so the term Son of God has a theological importance. This is God's Son in the flesh, but it also has a political importance. The kingdom of Rome is not God's kingdom. That's not the true Son of God. This is the Son of God, right? There's a great film that one of our co-ministers here at the church showed to us, and I wish I could remember who it was. But he's the guy, he says, "Come and see." Anybody know what I'm talking about? You ever seen those films? He tours Rome or something, and he kind of walks where Jesus walked and tells a story. And he shows how Jesus' crucifixion mirrored the sort of the coronation ceremony for the Roman Empire. Roman emperor. I don't know. Anyways, it was if I can think to tell you, I'll tell you what that was. But the Son of God was also a political term, as well as a theological statement for us. And so when you look at the Old Testament, like passages like Isaiah 7:14, Isaiah 9, we look at those passages as talking about Jesus, whereas the rabbis and people like that would have tried to find some sort of historical application to them without looking at them as necessarily talking about the Messiah in the way that we do today. So they did have some different ways of trying to answer these questions. The problem was they didn't have the missing puzzle piece that we have, which is Jesus, right? So when they said that they were the Christ, it did not necessarily come with all of the theological import that it does when we say that expression, the Christ. When we say that Jesus is the Christ, we know what that means in the fullest sense of the term anointed one, Messiah, but they might not have been using that term in that same exact way when claiming to be the Christ. Okay, Karen, what you got?
Sorry, but so their Messiah, what did they expect? To take back Rome for Israel?
Yes, to take back Rome from Israel. That's what they expected.
Okay.
You know how Jesus says, "You will not see me again until you say, 'Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord,'" from Matthew 23, right there at the very, very end, the last second to last verse or so. That's a quotation from Psalm 118, I believe. And when they would say that, is the idea is, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Here comes the Messiah over the hill with his army, coming to save us at the last minute, right? So they're saying that. I mean, just imagine you're being destroyed by the Romans, the temple's about to fall, and you're just ready. You're just ready for the Messiah to appear any moment, you know? And so you're saying, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's coming over the hill any second. But he never did, because they weren't going to be delivered from the Romans, because they did not choose the way of peace. They brought that upon themselves. So, yeah, there we go. Anything else before we move on here? Remember, this is our half-hour week because Laura's got the appointment, so we've only got 7 more minutes here. So, okay. Okay, so they brought in false brothers, Galatians 2:4, sorry, who had sneaked in to spy out our freedom, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to enslave us. That theme of slavery is going to be prevalent throughout the book. We're going to notice it, freedom versus slavery, all the way through, especially in the allegory in Galatians 4. But in Galatians 1, look at verse 4. He says, who gave himself for our sins, that he might rescue us from this present evil age. You see that idea of being rescued versus enslaved? They were trying to undo the very thing that Jesus had done for them, which is to rescue them. So I've got Caden with me. He's going to help out, finish out the class. Can you wave to Carol and Karen and Carrie? Say, hey. Can you wave? All right, just being bashful, huh? Okay, let's look at verse 5, and then we'll be done. He says, but we did not yield in subjection to them, even for an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. So they did not yield to this idea that the Gentiles needed to be circumcised, even for an hour, he says, in order that the truth of the gospel, that is the unencumbered gospel of Jesus, the law-free gospel of Jesus, would remain with them. If they put them under circumcision, they put them under the whole law. That's what Paul says in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 3. Now, the other thing about that is, Paul seems to contradict himself, because in the very next chapter, in Acts 16, who does Paul have circumcised? Remember, half Jew, half Gentile man. Starts with the T.
Timothy.
Starts with a T,
Yeah.
ends with the Timothy. Yeah, Timothy. He has Timothy circumcised. Why? Because Timothy was Jewish. He came from a Jewish heritage, and so he does not yield for 1 hour with a man who is a Gentile completely. But when it comes to a fellow who was of Jewish descent, he had him do that. Why? Because the law hadn't passed away just yet. It had not yet been fulfilled. Jesus said in Matthew 5:17 and 18 that not one jot or tittle will pass from the law until all is fulfilled. And even Paul himself in Acts 21, he went through this purification ritual, had a sacrifice offered on his behalf to show that he still walked orderly and kept the law. So when it came to the Gentiles, he did not budge for a minute. But when it came to Timothy, he allowed that to happen because Timothy was Jewish. Which means, by the way, following Paul's logic in Galatians 5, that Timothy was bound to keep the law. You look back at Galatians 5, he says that if anyone is circumcised, he is obligated to keep the whole law. So Timothy had to keep the things in the law, just like Paul was still doing at that point. All right. We're going to stop right there. We'll get into verses 6 through 10 next week. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we close? Oh, Carrie. Oh, you're just saying bye-bye? Oh, okay. Hang on a second. Let me get you. Oh, there you go.
Okay. So Timothy had to keep the law, and so did Paul until the temple was destroyed?
I believe so, to at least an extent. Now, they did it completely different than what they did before. Before Paul was converted, he said that he kept that in Philippians 3 that he had righteousness which was of the law. And what he said about that is that it was his own righteousness. Paul's relationship to the law changed when he became a Christian, in that he no longer worked to the point of justification, but he worked from the point of justification. In other words, he was not working because so that he could be justified. He was working because he had been justified. Now, look at Acts chapter 21. Look at Acts 21 real quick. And then this will be our final passage here before we close. In Acts 21, he bumped his head on the desk. In Acts 21, we look at verse 20, and Paul comes and he's talking to James and some of the elders there in Jerusalem. And when they heard about them, the Gentiles being converted, they began glorifying God, and they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. And they have been told about you, that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to abandon Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor walk according to the customs." So they heard this rumor that Paul was telling them that they didn't have to keep the law at all, that they shouldn't. They should abandon Moses. He said, "So what is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Therefore do as we tell you. We have 4 men who have a vow upon themselves. Take them along and purify yourself together with them, and pay their expenses, so they may shave their heads, and then everyone will know that there is nothing to what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also conform, keeping the law." So Paul goes through with this ritual, as you can read in the following passages. I've got to go pretty quickly here. He does that ritual to show that he was also keeping the law. Now, they weren't doing it for the point of righteousness, for the point of self-righteousness, or for the point of justification. The sole reason why they did that is because had they not, their ministry would have been completely ineffective. Had Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost and say, "Okay, guys, no more sacrifices. You can eat some bacon now. I got some in the back," for those of you who were baptized or whatever, they wouldn't have been able to save us all. And so the way that Jesus worded it in John 17 is, "I don't pray that you take them out of the world, but I want you to keep them safe in the world." He said they are not of the world, but don't take them out of it. They lived in that Jewish world without that being their home. Now, in Hebrews 13, what Paul says is, he says, Jesus was crucified outside the gate. And so now it's time for us to go to him outside the camp. For here we do not have a continuing city, but we're seeking the one which is to come. In other words, that there was no reason for them to remain in that camp any longer. It was time for them to go out, leave Jerusalem, leave that system, because it was about to come crashing down. So did he have to keep the law? Did every single Jew keep it? I don't know, but the ones in Jerusalem did. They were still zealous for the law. Paul went through the motions to show that he kept it to some degree. At the same time, though, Paul said, "To the Jews I became a Jew so that I might win the Jews, and to the Greeks I became a Greek so that I might win the Greeks." So there's situations where mercy triumphed over judgment, but that's no different than what Jesus was doing already, because he went to the Samaritans, asked for a cup of water. He touched the lepers. That was against the law. He made the argument that the priests break the law every Sabbath when they're working in the temple, and that even David broke the law when he went and picked grain for his men on the Sabbath. But what he said was mercy triumphs over judgment, and I think that's the way in which they kept the law, and I think that they kept it more truthfully than anyone had ever done before, because the spirit of the reason that they kept it changed. So we can talk about that more next week if you like, Carrie. But just I just thought I'd try to touch on it there, and do what I can to answer in what little time I got. But hey, I've got to go. Laura's motioning at me here, so come say hey, Laura. There she is. Oh, she's got to go get the baby. All right, see you guys later. Thank you so much for coming, and we will catch you next week at 6:30